Cool. We can move on to our main focuses of the week. The first film is One Man and His Shoes by Yemi Bamiro. It's a film about many things, but at the heart of it is the relationship between Michael Jordan and the company Nike, and the furore around the release of the Air Jordan trainers, and then by extension, it's also a relationship, or rather, someone described it as a celebratory. It's a celebratory account, really, of the relationship between Michael Jordan and the rest of mainstream black culture of the time, especially through film and TV, through Spike Lee's involvement in the adverts for Air Jordan trainers. It was a documentary that came out in October, which is now available on iPlayer. The director is actually has directed a lot of portrait type films and is a photographer as well, and I thought that's where it was at its strongest. I thought it was a very interesting portrait of a man and a brand and the relationship between him and the brand and so on. So cinematographically, it's well put together and it's engaging and it's quite a fun watch. I had a few issues with some of the problems that weren't fully addressed. So
I do too. Let's see if they're the same.
So the film does address the fact that kids start killing each other for the Air Jordans because they are expensive. They're $140. It does condemn Nike's marketing campaign, and it does really place the guilt on them for that side of things. But it didn't, and I don't know if that's its role at that point, but I feel like it should be touched on. They didn't really address the fact that it's part of a bigger problem. To be honest, it's not solely Nike's responsibility. It's more the fact that, well, it's consumer capitalism. So these products, whether they're Nike Air Jordans or whatever, are marketed at children of families that are generally poor and can't afford these consumer goods, and people get into debt. So I had an issue with the fact that that wasn't fully fleshed out. Nike was presented, now I don't know if you felt that, but it was very like the story of Nike felt a bit rags to riches. You had the sense that it was a modest sort of family-owned brand whose success kind of took everyone by surprise. Nike's a huge brand, it's a huge corporation, and it's been responsible for a lot of business malpractice and really poor working practices. Now, the documentary doesn't address at all the manufacturing of the shoes, which I had an issue with. So that's something. But also the fact that they're very cynical in monetizing the street culture and appropriating what is initially a counterculture and then commodifying it and making products that they sell on to these to their basically impoverished customer base. So these are the two main issues I had with it.
Yeah, I think I agree. I agree with that part of it, right? Because that is the real issue. I mean, I hadn't thought about it in terms of how they presented Nike as a rags to riches story, but even they say like, oh, they were number 3 and then they moved to number 1. It's like number 3. You know, I mean, like, yes, they were number 3 along with my shoe shop that I ran out of my garage. You know what I mean? So yeah, it wasn't a David and Goliath situation the way they were saying, but I do think that it did do well to contextualize the phenomenon of Air Jordan sneakers. So it showed that their social, cultural, and racial significance, and that it was their marketing strategies that were groundbreaking. So all of the innovation they had in that sense, I think is important to understand, because it certainly wasn't as if, oh, Michael Jordan came along and made this brand what it was. And I think that's commonly how people think of it. So it was nice to show, no, lots of money was pumped in a way that it hadn't been pumped in before. And of course, it was timing as well. So they were also looking for someone who could be an all-American type that was like Michael Jordan. So this, for me, this came up to say, you know, in the film, I believe it was the sentiment, even though it was said by a talking head, that sports is a microcosm of society. Mm-hmm. And it is not. I disagree with that. And for a full explanation, for anyone interested, the sociology of sport does an analysis around sport as an institution. So it can't escape social conflicts or institutionalizing social divisions more or less than, it can't escape, no institution can. So I'd argue, though, that sports crafts a particular kind of propaganda. And I think the fact that it focuses on marketing brings makes that point very clear. So I hope this isn't misunderstood. I did like the film. I enjoyed it, but that's still what's important. I mean, just as a side note, I've never liked sports. I played basketball in sixth grade because I'm tall, and I was harassed for years after about why I don't play sports by friends, by friends, strangers, and family. And I've also not really been a part of the whole sneaker buying phenomenon. So even as a teenager, when it was time for me to buy sneakers, I would have to get my friends and their boyfriends to tell me what to get because I had no idea. And I still don't. So, for example, a few weeks ago, my friend commented on my shoes. I had just these Kate Spade sneakers. And he looked at him and he said, "Oh, so you just took the laces out?" And he'd never heard of that brand before. He's like, "Kate Spade, what is that?"
Now, I've heard the name.
See,
I don't really know what it is. I'm going to have to Google it.
He hadn't even heard the name. So, with that said, as you can imagine, a lot of what was covered in this film was new to me, especially the specifics of the marketing, which I was really interested in. And I do think, though, that, yeah, I just can't say that enough, that the marketing, like you're saying, the appropriation of a particular kind of Black culture, right? Not Black culture in general, but and that's come now to represent Black culture, was what was part of their secret sauce. And that's not new, right? So you always have aspects of Black imagery and certain aspects of Black culture used to sell products, to be cool, to be cutting edge, to be whatever, right?
Yeah.
So I also think that it was how Jordan worked as a spokesperson as part of that point, because he was pro-Black culture. You have a dark, tall Black man who can be symbolic of a particular kind of masculinity, prowess, and power, but not be pro-Black power. And by that, I mean Black people having actual power, a share of it in politics and wealth and decision-making institutions. He wasn't pro that, but he can represent that in a Black body. And and it was also framed, back to your point about it being this sort of rags to riches story. The documentary was also trying to sell it as it being revolutionary because subsequently athletes were able to have these lucrative branding deals. But I don't think that's what made it revolutionary. So just because you have a few Black millionaires, a few Black athletes specifically get rich, that's nothing. I think it was revolutionary because of what it sold to Black people. So it sold the dream and belief. And to be fair, I think it sold it to white people too, that Black people are essentially white people, but darker. So we can excel in particular fields that we're suited for, right? Hence why it has to be an athlete, not a biologist, not a chemist, not a tech star, right? You have to do things that you're suited for. And that real power lies in sales and consumerism and athleticism, not in ownership. And that was a real powerful message that I think we're still living with now. And you see the rise of this myth of Black consumer power, which looks to status symbols, power through possession, and even with having spokespeople. They broke it down well in the movie to say how Michael Jordan got a profit share and how that no longer happens anymore. But we even believe, and by we, I mean the common misconceptions that people have, that spokespeople share in a profit that's just as good as ownership. And it is not. It is not the same thing. And people get very confused. And really, these are different kinds of exploitative relationships. And at the end of the day, you still don't own anything. You're still on payroll. And I think this is where the film let us down, because it didn't explore these issues. It went down the road of corporate social responsibility. And that, Nike, Air Jordan, Michael Jordan can do more to speak out against the violence. So on the one hand, I'm selfishly pleased that they're beating this drum, because I'll likely end up working in the corporate social responsibility again. So thank you for promoting this. However, it's not a root cause. So we've never watched a documentary about the rise of the diamond and women getting mugged for their engagement rings. And that would be the analogy.
Yeah.
And in that way, you can see that it's absurd because it's nothing to do with who's making the money, why they're making the money, and that generally people are wearing them in fine. So I'm sure that jewelry theft does happen, but it would not, it wouldn't be the focus of a film because that's not the real issue. So I wasn't really sure why they went down that road of the people who have been murdered. And, I don't want to be flippant about that because I can't imagine the pain of losing someone to something so,
Or trivial.
uh, yeah, to something like that. Yet it's still not the norm. Like you're saying, the norm is the issue how we're all going into debt
Yeah, that's the
because
bigger
of
issue.
consumerism in general. So it's not just limited to Nike. And and the question then is what happens for people who don't even have access to debt? Because you still have to be somewhat privileged to be able to go into that debt. And then there's people who cannot go into debt. I remember when I was probably 10 and I first learned about layaway. I had never heard of that in my life. I thought, layaway, what is that? Huh?
Off what now?
So layaway, they have this at stores. And mind you, there'll be certain stores. So it wasn't available at any mall I shopped at growing up. But if you went down 15 miles to another city, the way it worked is you have items that you want to buy, but you don't have the money. And so they hold them for you and you make payments on it. And then you get it. So it's layaway. So the
Oh,
store will hold on to the items and then you come in and you make payments on it until you can take it.
I've never heard of that system.
There's a reason you never heard of that system because that's a sort of, and of course, it's one of those things like check cashing, right? There's different systems set up for poor people, but they
Yeah.
don't have layaway at Foot Locker. And then, so seriously though, so then it's like, okay, so then what happens when you shut people out of that credit system in a system where everyone else is relying on credit? So when you look at it that way, you see that it's a different kind of problem versus some, and I don't even know if they didn't really hint at it being gang culture or something, but it's like, but what are you saying then about these black youth? Because it was young people, right?
Yeah.
It looked like who were getting killed and also killing. What are you saying about them when you don't look at the issue in that way? You make it about poor black people when it's not about poor black people. They're just the ones who are suffering the consequences from that, if you get what I mean.
Yeah.
And yeah, it was disappointing that they didn't do that and instead made it about CSR. But again, thanks, because I will need that job next year. my contract is ending. So I can point to something like that and say, this is the program I had put in place. They also could have went down the road to say, okay, what kind of deals do athletes get now? Or, I mean, I don't know, but they also maybe could have ended it without using Black Death to send a message that didn't really work, in my opinion. But I
Well,
still
that's
did
the
like it, so I
thing.
would encourage people to see the film.
It felt more shoehorned in, like it was an issue that they felt they couldn't just not mention because it would be brought up. So they should address the fact that a number of people. Plus, there was this demonstration taking place, so people are quite vocal about the fact that a small number of people have actually been killed for those shoes.
Yeah,
So it would have felt odd to leave that out. But the way it was touched on was very much like the brand just needs to be more responsible and address those concerns. Whereas I would argue that it's not really about that at all. It's there is
no.
much more at stake, and it's not.
And you know what they could have talked about too was a black aspiration that has come out of that because people still use Michael Jordan, one athlete out of hundreds, as a model for what you can do, and unfortunately have that as an actual career goal. No, that's not really an option. Not only because they're not doing deals like that, but very few people make it to professional sports.